There's a question that doesn't get asked enough. Who actually profits when nations go to war? Not in some abstract sense, but concretely, which companies, which sectors, which families have built generational wealth from military conflict? Today, we're examining the business side of American warfare, looking at how certain corporations have maintained defense contracts across multiple generations, what that's meant for military spending, and why the system has proven so resistant to reform. This isn't about conspiracy theories. We're looking at public contracts, documented profits, and historical patterns that are hiding in plain sight. Let's dive into the economics of the American defense industry. The story begins in 1802 when a French chemist named Eleuthère Irénée Dupont established a gunpowder mill along the Brandywine River in Delaware. His timing was strategic. America had just won independence and was expanding westward, creating steady demand for explosives. The story begins in 1802 when a French chemist named Eleuthère Irénée Dupont established a gunpowder mill along the Brandywine River in Delaware. His timing was strategic. America had just won independence and was expanding westward, creating steady demand for explosives. What's remarkable isn't just that DuPont supplied munitions, but how they positioned themselves to become indispensable. By the War of 1812, they'd secured their first major military contract. The pattern they established would become a template: maintain production capacity during peacetime, scale rapidly when conflict emerges, secure government contracts based on existing relationships. During the Civil War, DuPont's operation expanded dramatically. Union forces required unprecedented quantities of gunpowder. Estimates suggest over 4 million pounds throughout the conflict. The company ran continuous operations, and their contracts exceeded $10 million, equivalent to hundreds of millions today. Here's what's interesting about their political positioning. The DuPont family held varied political views, with some members even sympathizing with Confederate positions. Yet the company sold exclusively to the Union not because of ideological commitment, but because that's where the contracts were largest. After Union victory, this commercial pragmatism was reframed as patriotic service. World War I transformed DuPont from a major supplier into an industrial titan. Before American entry in 1917, they sold explosives to Allied powers. Once the U.S. joined, production scaled exponentially. The company ultimately provided approximately 40% of Allied explosives, and their net earnings jumped from $5 million in 1914 to $82 million by 1918, roughly a 1,600% increase in 4 years. The critical move came after the armistice. Instead of returning those profits, DuPont diversified into chemicals, plastics, and synthetic materials. War profits became the foundation for a peacetime industrial empire, though military contracts never stopped. Standard Oil and energy dominance. John D. Rockefeller founded Standard Oil in 1870, and within a decade controlled roughly 90% of American oil refining. This near monopoly became strategically crucial as naval vessels transitioned from coal to petroleum-based fuel in the 1890s. The Spanish-American War of 1898 was brief, but established oil as a military necessity. As conflicts industrialized, petroleum products became essential for tanks, aircraft, ships, and transport vehicles. Even after antitrust action broke up Standard Oil in 1911, Rockefeller maintained control through successor companies Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, and others. World War I marked the first major conflict where oil proved decisive. Rockefeller-controlled companies supplied Allied forces with fuel products worth hundreds of millions. But their approach differed from DuPont's single-client strategy. Standard Oil's international subsidiaries sold petroleum to both sides, operating through neutral countries even after American entry into the war. Legally, these were separate entities. Practically, profits flowed to the same shareholders. This strategy generated enormous wealth. John D. Rockefeller became the world's first billionaire, and the family diversified into banking, real estate, and philanthropy, though petroleum remained central. World War II brought scrutiny. Standard Oil of New Jersey faced investigation for sharing synthetic rubber patents with German chemical company IG Farben, potentially providing Nazi Germany with technology that extended their military capacity. Senator Harry Truman led hearings that concluded these actions had damaged Allied war efforts. Yet no prosecutions followed. The military required Standard Oil's fuel supplies, making the company effectively prosecution-proof. This pattern would repeat. Subsequent conflicts in Korea, Vietnam, and the Middle East all required petroleum products, and Rockefeller's successor companies supplied them under lucrative long-term contracts. The Morgan banking system, J.P. Morgan established his banking empire in the late 19th century, and by 1900, J.P. Morgan and Company dominated American finance. Morgan recognized a fundamental economic principle. Governments at war will borrow at nearly any terms because the alternative is military defeat. When World War I began in 1914, America maintained official neutrality while American banks, led by Morgan, extended over $2 billion in loans to Britain and France, equivalent to more than $50 billion today. These loans financed weapons purchases, much of it from American manufacturers, creating a circular flow where borrowed money returned to the U.S. economy while interest accrued. Here's the strategic implication. By 1917, Britain and France owed American banks so substantially that their defeat would have triggered an American financial crisis. If Allied powers lost, debts became uncollectible, threatening major banks with collapse. When President Wilson requested a war declaration in April 1917, the economic context was unavoidable. Senator George Norris of Nebraska argued explicitly that financial interests were driving intervention, stating America was entering upon the command of gold. He opposed the declaration, but Congress approved it. Morgan's loans were effectively secured by American military power. Post-war, Morgan banks profited again through debt restructuring. Germany owed reparations to Allied powers, who owed debts to America. Morgan arranged loans allowing Germany to pay reparations, which Allied powers used for American debt repayment, with Morgan collecting fees at each transaction point. The Dawes Plan of 1924 and Young Plan of 1929, both structured by Morgan bankers, refinanced billions while generating millions in fees. World War II followed similar patterns. Morgan banks financed British purchases before American entry, then underwrote war bonds and Treasury securities after Pearl Harbor. Post-war reconstruction through the Marshall Plan was administered partly through Morgan-connected institutions. Throughout the Cold War and subsequent conflicts, Morgan banks eventually consolidated into J.P. Morgan Chase, continued underwriting government debt and financing defense contractors, profiting from interest and transaction fees. The Lowhead brothers, later spelled Lockheed, founded their aircraft company in 1912. World War I brought initial military contracts, though aviation's role was still limited, primarily reconnaissance with some bombing missions. Post-war, military aviation contracts largely evaporated, bankrupting many manufacturers. Lockheed survived by producing civilian aircraft while maintaining Pentagon relationships, positioning themselves for the next conflict. World War II proved aircraft decisive. Lockheed produced over 10,000 P-38 Lightning fighters and 2,800 Hudson bombers under contracts worth hundreds of millions. But Lockheed's real innovation wasn't engineering, it was political strategy. They hired retired military officers as executives, establishing relationships with current Pentagon leadership. They strategically located manufacturing facilities in congressional districts where representatives needed constituent employment. This made the company politically difficult to oppose. The Cold War sustained continuous contracting. Lockheed built the U-2 spy plane, SR-71 Blackbird, and C-130 cargo transport still operational today. Their consistent strategy involved initial low-ball cost estimates to secure contracts, then requesting additional funding when projects inevitably exceeded projections. The C-5 Galaxy transport plane exemplifies this approach. The initial 1965 contract specified $2.1 billion. Actual delivery costs reached $5.3 billion, roughly 150% over budget. Lockheed operated under cost-plus contracts, meaning all expenses plus guaranteed profit margins were covered. The Pentagon couldn't cancel after investing billions, so they paid. This pattern continued through subsequent conflicts. By the 1990s, industry consolidation led to Lockheed's merger with Martin Marietta, creating today's Lockheed Martin, the world's largest defense contractor with approximately $65 billion in 2023 revenue, roughly 90% from government contracts. The F-35 fighter program represents the apex of this system. Originally budgeted at $233 billion, current lifetime cost estimates exceed $1.7 trillion, approximately 7 times initial projections. Each cost overrun is absorbed by the Pentagon because cancellation would mean acknowledging waste while losing the sunk investment. Lockheed continues profiting from overruns. Halliburton's government contracting model, founded in 1919 by Orel Halliburton as an oil services company. The firm expanded into military infrastructure during World War II, constructing bases, airfields, and ports under accelerated timelines that often precluded competitive bidding. The contracting model was straightforward. Military needs infrastructure rapidly. Halliburton possesses expertise and equipment. No-bid contracts are issued citing urgency. Cost-plus pricing guarantees profit regardless of expenses. Risk transfers entirely to the government. Vietnam marked significant expansion. Halliburton subsidiary Brown & Root constructed roads, ports, and airfields throughout South Vietnam under contracts worth billions, awarded without competitive bidding, partly due to political connections. Founder George Brown was a major Lyndon B. Johnson donor, and Johnson's presidency saw Brown & Root receive massive Vietnam infrastructure contracts. The Gulf War of 1991 brought Halliburton back prominently. Dick Cheney, serving as Secretary of Defense, oversaw contracts to Halliburton for Saudi Arabia and Kuwait facilities. After leaving government, Cheney became Halliburton's CEO in 1995, running the company until 2000 when he became vice president under George W. Bush. Iraq and Afghanistan saw unprecedented Halliburton contracting. Through subsidiary KBR, the company received over $40 billion in contracts no bid. Cost-plus pricing for base construction, food services, fuel supply, and comprehensive logistics. Pentagon Inspector General audits identified billions in waste and overcharges. Billing for unserved meals, non-existent fuel deliveries, incomplete construction. Halliburton's defense cited chaotic war zones making perfect accounting impossible. The government continued payment. From 2003 to 2008, Halliburton's government contracts increased roughly 400% and stock prices tripled. When Cheney left office in 2009, he retained Halliburton stock options worth millions. 7-step process. Examining these companies reveals a consistent approach replicated across 150 years. Step 1. Pre-positioning. Companies establish essential capabilities before conflicts emerge. DuPont built explosive manufacturing capacity during peace. Rockefeller monopolized refining. Morgan cultivated banking relationships. Lockheed maintained military contracts between wars. Halliburton developed infrastructure expertise. When war began, they were ready while competitors weren't. Step 2. Initial contracts. Governments require immediate supplies, eliminating time for competitive bidding. Pre-positioned companies receive no-bid contracts justified by national security urgency. Once you're the proven supplier, subsequent contracts come easier. Step 3. Cost-plus pricing. Most major war contracts from the Civil War onward used cost-plus structures. Contractors bill all expenses plus guaranteed profit percentages. This eliminates risk cost overruns are covered, extended timelines increase profit. The incentive structure rewards maximizing costs, not efficiency. Step 4. Budget overruns. Virtually every major weapon system in recent decades has exceeded budget. The F-35 by 7 times. Zumwalt destroyer by 3 times. Littoral combat ships by double. This isn't incompetence, it's the business model. Underbid to win contracts, then revise estimates upward. Governments can't cancel after major investment, so they pay and contractors profit from overruns. Step 5. Regulatory capture. Retiring military officers frequently join defense contractors. Generals who approve Lockheed contracts become Lockheed executives. Admirals overseeing shipbuilding join shipbuilding companies. This revolving door between Pentagon and industry ensures contract awarding officials maintain beneficial relationships. Step 6. Policy advocacy. Defense contractors spend millions on lobbying and campaign donations. They fund think tanks producing research advocating military intervention. Organizations like the Center for Strategic and International Studies and American Enterprise Institute receive contractor funding while publishing research supporting military action. During 2002 Iraq debates, contractors funded organizations producing intelligence assessments supporting invasion. They purchased advertisements and hired retired generals for media advocacy. When war was approved, these same contractors received billions in contracts. They didn't create the Iraq War, but they created an environment making war more likely, then profited from the outcome. Step 7. Profit diversification. War profits don't remain in weapons. DuPont used explosive profits building a chemical empire. Rockefeller used oil profits acquiring banks and real estate. Morgan used war lending profits financing peacetime industries. Companies diversify so wealth persists beyond individual conflicts, creating multi-generational dynasties. The scale of extraction, quantifying the profits. Examining documented contracts reveals staggering totals. DuPont, over $50 billion in inflation-adjusted. Military contracts since 1802. Rockefeller companies over $100 billion in military fuel sales since 1898. Morgan banks, approximately $75 billion in war financing interest and fees. Lockheed Martin predecessors, over $200 billion in aircraft and systems since 1917. Halliburton, over $60 billion in logistics and infrastructure since 1942. Combined documented contracts exceed $485 billion. This excludes indirect profits, stock appreciation, real estate purchased with war capital, peacetime industries built using war profits. Including those factors, total extraction likely exceeds $1 trillion. This money originated from taxpayers. Every dollar paid to DuPont for explosives was extracted from American workers through taxation. Every dollar paid to Halliburton for logistics came from deficit spending that future generations will repay. These aren't standard market profits. These are public funds transferred to private entities, justified by warfare. Current defense spending, is this historical pattern or current reality? Consider 2023. The U.S. military budget reached $816 billion. The five largest defense contractors, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, General Dynamics, and Northrop Grumman, received over $200 billion in contracts, approximately 25% of the entire defense budget flowing to five companies. The established pattern continues. These companies employ former Pentagon officials. They lobby Congress extensively. They locate factories strategically. The F-35 program has suppliers in 45 states, meaning 90 senators have constituents employed by the program. Voting against F-35 funding means opposing jobs in your state. So Congress continues appropriations despite being 7 times over budget, years behind schedule, and having over 800 documented defects. The template DuPont, established in 1802, operates today. War remains profitable for corporations, shareholders, executives, and politicians receiving donations and post-retirement positions. The only groups excluded from profit are soldiers who fight and taxpayers who fund operations. The opportunity cost. What was lost? Consider what $485 billion in documented war profits could have built. Free public college for American students for 2 decades, high-speed rail connecting major cities nationwide, universal health care for a decade, complete infrastructure reconstruction, every bridge and road, a century of cancer research funding. Instead, it purchased explosives, fuel, weapons, and logistics for wars, some necessary, many debatable. Companies profited while public goods suffered. This isn't about whether individual wars were justified. World War II was clearly necessary. But even necessary wars were exploited for maximum profit extraction. And numerous conflicts were encouraged, prolonged, or escalated because doing so was profitable. Vietnam could have concluded years earlier, but contractors lobbied for continuation. Iraq was justified partly through intelligence from contractor-funded think tanks. Afghanistan became a 20-year occupation partly because contractors generated billions rebuilding what was destroyed. The profit motive didn't create these wars, but it made them longer and more expensive than strategically necessary. The absence of prosecution, despite evidence of overcharging, fraud, and profiteering, criminal accountability remains virtually absent. DuPont faced investigation for monopolistic explosive practices in the 1930s, no action taken. Standard Oil was broken up for monopoly violations, but Rockefellers retained the wealth and companies gradually reconsolidated. Morgan banks were investigated for World War I profiteering, no prosecutions. Halliburton was investigated for Iraq overcharging. They paid fines representing a fraction of profits while keeping contracts. Lockheed was investigated for bribing foreign officials to purchase weapons. They paid fines, no executives faced incarceration. The pattern is consistent. Investigations find wrongdoing. Fines are assessed representing small percentages of profits. Number individuals are prosecuted. Companies continue operating. The pattern continues. Why? Because these companies are considered too important to prosecute. The military depends on them. Congress depends on them for district employment. The economy has integrated them so thoroughly that prosecution would cause disruption. So they're protected even when breaking laws. Conclusion. The perpetual cycle. 5 major corporate entities. 5 founding families. 150 years of American military history. Every major conflict following identical patterns. Position before conflict begins. Secure initial contracts through urgency. Employ cost-plus pricing eliminating risk. Overrun budgets systematically. Hire regulators into executive positions. Lobby for policies increasing military intervention. Diversify profits into peacetime wealth. This isn't speculation, it's documented in public contracts. Recorded profits and historical patterns that remain remarkably consistent. The system continues operating today. Defense spending grows annually. The same companies receive the largest contracts. Cost overruns are absorbed as standard procedure. Former Pentagon officials rotate into industry positions. Think tanks funded by contractors advocate for continued intervention. The fundamental question isn't whether this happened, the documentation is clear. The question is whether anything will change it. Historical precedent suggests it won't, because the companies have become too powerful, politicians too dependent on their campaign funding and employment offers, and the public too distracted or resigned to mount sustained opposition. Understanding this system doesn't require believing in shadowy conspiracies. It requires looking at public information. Who receives contracts? How costs escalate? Where retired officials work? Who funds policy research? And recognizing the pattern that's been repeating for over a century. The economics are straightforward. War is profitable for those positioned to supply it, and they have every incentive to ensure it continues. That's the system. That's the history. That's the pattern still operating today.